Afternoon, it's Friday the 6th of March 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish.
Well, Brian, it's been a busy week in the world of defence and security. On Monday, we had a Brookings Institute held an event here defending NATO's eastern flank, a conversation in Russia with Estonia's Minister of Defence. So that's all about European defence. On Wednesday, then, we had the Inter-Parliamentary Conference for the Common Foreign Security Policy and the Common Security Defence Policy held in Zagreb. Also on Wednesday and continuing into yesterday, we had also in Zagreb was the informal meeting of EU defence ministers. And then yesterday, the UK's Defence Minister, Ben Wallace, was in Washington, D.C. at the Atlantic Council. And today, is the EU informal meeting of foreign affairs ministers. So joining us to discuss all this today, Brian, is Mark Anderson. It's been a while, Mark. Welcome back to the programme.
Great to be back, guys. Absolutely.
So Mark, let's take each of these in turn with the Brookings event. Estonia and Baltic neighbours constitute NATO's front lines, and the big bad bogeyman is Russia.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yuri Luik, the Minister of Defense, the Republic of Estonia, who used to be Estonia's ambassador to Moscow, addressed the Brookings Institution Monday, March 2nd. And I made sure to be there and stir up a little bit of trouble. I like to drop an anvil into their programs once in a while, or at least stir it up a tad, because they just keep peddling that tiresome narrative that Russia has a monopoly on geopolitical wrongdoing.
Right. Okay. Well, let's just have a look at a little bit of your intervention here.
Vladimir Putin is a lot of things, rather untrustworthy in a lot of ways, but he's not stupid. What benefit would he get out of attacking the Baltics? I mean, the response, the retaliation would be overwhelming.
You know, wars have been started by very smart men. So it's not necessarily a guarantee that only stupid people start wars. It will be evident usually later that it was extremely stupid to start a war, but often people don't get it beforehand. I mean, it's starting a conflict is often something which is to do with. Let me ask you, why did Russia attack Ukraine?
He didn't seem to be particularly able to answer that question, Mark.
Yeah, well, why did Russia attack Ukraine? Well, Russia really didn't attack Ukraine. Of course, they don't allow you to ask a follow-up question. It's a matter of interpretation, as we know. They went into Crimea because there was a Russian culture there that they wanted to protect from the Victoria Nuland gang that overthrew the Ukrainian government in February of 2014, 6 years ago. And so who attacked who depends on which end of the telescope you're looking down, and they don't want to address that.
Indeed. Now, coming on to the next event that we mentioned there, and that is the Inter-Parliamentary Conference for the Common Foreign Security Policy and the Common Security and Defence Policy of the EU, that was being held in Zagreb. And this event was attended by Tobias Ellwood, who, of course, is the new chairman of the Defence Select Committee in the UK Parliament. So let's have a brief listen to what he had to say.
Well, as our history shows, the UK security can't be separated from European security. And with threats to our collective security, stability and prosperity increasing, we must continue to work closely together. So I'm here in Zagreb, in Croatia, representing the UK Parliament at the European Conference on Foreign and Security Policy. And I'm making sure that despite Brexit, the UK voice is heard. We retain the largest armed force in Europe. It's absolutely right that we continue to be actively engaged. There remains a huge disjoint between the EU on the one hand and NATO on the other when talking about defence and security, now all the more prevalent following Brexit. So I stressed in my speeches the UK's continued commitment to that European security, but also my concern that reducing the UK to EU third-party status and exclude us from projects such as the Galileo satellite project would undermine that European security. I hope as we establish a new relationship with the EU NATO continues to be recognised as the cornerstone to the continent's security.
Well, of course, NATO is recognised as the cornerstone of European security in the diagram, which defines the architecture of European Defence Union. So that isn't going to change. But Brian, Britain has the largest military in Europe. Tobias Ellwood is going to be the chair of the new chair of the Defence Select Committee. Of course, the Defence Select Committee is supposed to hold government to account. It's supposed to question government on their defence policy and hold them to account. But it's absolutely clear from what he's just said that he is 100% behind Britain's involvement in European defence.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's a job to know what is actually going on in some ways, because it appears confusing, but very often this confusion has been used in order to get policy in out of sight of the public, and I think this is what's continuing here. So we're out of the EU, but now we're clamouring to get back into the Galileo project. We say that Europe needs us because of our overall defence capability, but we've got to go begging to the EU that we've got to be allowed to play with their toys. And at the end of the day, we could say, if we come back to history, it's been Europe that's had to call on the UK actually to come and assist on 2 occasions or more. So what is this man talking about? And the other thing I'll say is it's when you look at the background and the environment in which these talks are working, this is like some common purpose leaders' dinner, isn't it? With all the pieces set out. So I don't take this seriously, but we also need to ask that if we are so committed to European defence, why are Britain's armed forces in such a perilous state? We're talking about maybe the Royal Navy going down to below 19 ships, which is just incredible. And at the moment, we're talking about a British army that can only put 20,000 men, effectively a division, into combat for any period of time. So there's a disjoint here, Mike. I haven't got to the bottom of it, but it seems to me that there's just a game being played for the public. Meanwhile, relations with Europe over EU Defence Union just carry on.
That's absolutely right. Now, of course, at the moment, the negotiations are... Oh, sorry. I do apologise. That's... hit the wrong button there, but don't worry. European future relationship negotiations have been going on this week, finished yesterday. Well, one of the key things that's come out of this is that really they don't want to talk about defence. Now, we're going to show once again the diagram that the EU released, which sets out the framework for the future relationship negotiations in a second. But in the meantime, let's have a look at this, because these are the negotiating groups: trade in goods, trade in services and investment and other issues, level playing field for open and fair competition, transport, energy and civil nuclear cooperation, fisheries, mobility and social security coordination, law enforcement and judicial cooperation in criminal matters, thematic cooperation and participation in union programs, and finally, horizontal arrangements and government. So,
what a brilliant expression that is.
So,
horizontal arrangements.
Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
It was particularly pertinent when, well, maybe it's pertinent now that Ms. von der Leyen is president. But anyway, never mind. 11 of these negotiating groups for the negotiations on the future relationship. There should be 12, because if you're paying attention, you'll notice that there's nothing here about security and defence. Well, it's very interesting that in the documentation, the EU said this: the European Commission notes that the United Kingdom proposes not to include a negotiating group dedicated to cooperation on foreign policy, security and defence. So, in other words, it's wrapped up in all those other 11. They do not want to have a separate negotiating group for this particular subject,
Right,
because if there is a separate negotiating group, Brian, it would have to be discussed in the press.
Right, so what we've been told is the most important issue, that the security of Europe, the defence of Europe is absolutely key. Britain is falling over itself to say that we're going to still stay involved in that, but we're not going to have a group. There can only be one answer, and that is because the British public, largely via the UK column, is now aware of EU Defence Union, and if you had a group discussing it, everything would be in the open.
Well, that is indeed the case. Now let's just remind ourselves how important the EU feels that the security partnership is. Here's their diagram for the future partnership. Economic partnership on the left, security partnership on the right. The security partnership does include police and judicial cooperation, but there's a huge section there on foreign security and defence policy. This is not being openly discussed still, despite what Tobias Ellwood has said in his little speech to camera at Zagreb. And just before we move on, I just do want to mention that the subtitling on that video was his, not ours. So
Yes.
So a couple of people in the chat box noticing how far from English some of those words were spelt, but that's something else.
Don't blame us.
No, indeed.
No.
Now, as we mentioned then, also on Wednesday was the EU Defence Ministers' informal meeting, also in Zagreb. Well, here is a very glum-looking Jens Stoltenberg appearing at that. 6 European countries have now signed an agreement on the creation of the Lithuanian-led European Union's Cyber Rapid Response Team. So this is the first major institution being set up under PESCO. So this is Estonia, Lithuania, Croatia, Poland, and the Netherlands and Romania signing a memorandum of understanding in Zagreb. Under the agreement, international teams will be on standby in different countries, ready to respond to a cyber attack at any time. Lithuania has raised the idea, or they originally raised the idea of an EU Rapid Cyber Response Force in 2017. It went on standby in 2020, and it's now been created formally under the European Union's Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, part of the European Defence Union. So, Mark, in your discussions in your meetings at the Atlantic Council and so on that we're going to talk about in a second, was cyber a major topic of discussion?
Yes, it was mentioned at both. It was more prevalent at the Brookings Institution meeting this past Monday. It was noted that NATO's top cyber capabilities are in fact in Estonia. Who knew? And so it was stressed a lot at the Brookings meeting Monday, but mentioned at the Atlantic Council in passing. And it's also notable that when I asked about the European Defence Union at both meetings, on the side in casual conversations, people pled ignorance largely. They act like it either doesn't exist or they act like they've vaguely heard of it and they don't know any details. It all sounds very disingenuous to me. Even the top people at these think tanks act like they're, practically unaware of it. And it's very strange in that sense.
Well, this brings us now to what happened yesterday, which is Ben Wallace visiting the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. So how did that go, Mark?
Oh, it was good. He was a little late getting there. It's his first visit since Brexit that he's been to the United States. It's the first time he's ever spoken to a U.S. think tank, he said. And he was very straightforward. He spoke very quickly, a very kind of rapid tempo. And the big thing was an integrated foreign security and defense review is coming up. And that'll include this notion that the UK will carry a little bit more of its own weight so that the US can focus on its own things. And that'll be a form of burden sharing, he said. And he said, quote, "We want to make defense the spear of global Britain." I'll repeat that. I want to make defense the spear of global Britain. So we intend to carry out a full 360-degree exercise examining what we can do and how we can do it. And he went on to say they're going to review the Euro-Atlantic Alliance as part of this review, the great power competition, global issues, and homeland security. Those are 4 big things in this integrated foreign security and defense review. And he went on to say that the US, UK, and Five Eyes, that's of course Intel, will intensify the areas where they're currently being tested by the hybrid threats of Russia, China, and Iran. So that was sort of the core of his speech.
Sorry, Mark. How can defence be the spear of the UK's global Britain policy? That sounds like offence.
Well, correct. Offense is
Go on.
defense. In the Orwellian world that these people inhabit, offense and defense are one and the same. Just as this gentleman went on to say that peace and war, notions of peace and war are obsolete now, we pretty much just need to be on a permanent war footing. And this was the core of his speech once again. And he seemed a little bit, kind of like he was talking over his head a bit, like these things were almost outside his grasp. I guess he used to be a more mid-level officer in the British government. I'm not sure how long he's been defense minister, but he seems a little green, if you will, and not having dealt with these think tanks before. But I think you have an important quote from him.
Yes, let's just play that, because this is important to listen to.
Yeah.
Under my leadership, I'm determined that the Ministry of Defence adopts a more campaigning posture, since we must recognise that the threat no longer resides in the official definition of peace and war, but in the constant.
So you're absolutely right, Mark. And what he's reflecting there is an idea that's been coming out through British military and through British politicians for quite some time now, which is that there is no difference between peace and war in the modern world. These definitions of peace and war are obsolete. It doesn't matter anymore. Really what he's talking about, the constant, that means perpetual war. Brian, he's talking about hybrid warfare, the grey zone, all these kinds of, all this kind of terminology that they like to use. And he said, from the hybrid, as Mark has said, from the hybrid dangers emanating from Russia, China and Iran in the grey zone, to the danger our adversaries are posing to us in space. They're inventing, it seems to me, Brian, they're inventing enemies.
We could say they're inventing enemies, Mike, but I also think these people, I'm going to use the term, are living in their own reality. They exist in a world where there's all this newspeak. I notice he describes himself as a leader, and this to me says that Ben Wallace is into the common purpose frame of mind, that he is one of many leaders. And I think they use this language, and after a while it starts to take over their own heads. So they're given speeches to read. They don't really understand what it's about. And Ben Wallace, you're suggesting, Mark, that he's not very bright, and I think that's absolutely right, because it was only a few months ago that he was asked about legal matters to do with EU Defence Union, and he clearly was unable to answer any of that in a simple way. So I think these people are living in their own reality. They're not working properly. Their brains are not working properly because they're being damaged by the language. To say that we're going to be in perpetual state of war is straight out of the book 1984, I think.
Now, sorry, Mark, just to get, before we get a final comment on Ben Wallace from you, I just mentioned that, of course, those in the UK and in the EU that are interested in defence matters have heard a lot of the rhetoric in the last 18 months about the Sahel and the Sahel region of Africa. This is an area that the European Union and the UK are very interested in strategically. They're very concerned about China's influence and Russia's increasing influence in the area. They want to have, at least the European Union certainly wants to have, a massive expansion southwards. Now, as we mentioned on this programme a week or so ago, at the recent African Union meeting in Addis Ababa, the European Union wasn't given quite the warm welcome that they normally expect, but they are extremely interested in this region. And Ben Wallace, Mark, was highlighting again the what did he say? The turbocharged drugs, weapons, and people smuggling rings out of Western Asia and North Africa into Europe. He talked about the Sahel and so on. Of course, as we were mentioning in this program a couple of days ago, it is all very coincidental that as soon as Britain and the European Union get interested in a particular region, in this case the Sahel, we suddenly have the biggest growing Islamic insurgency operation developing in that very same region, which of course gives them the excuse to move more military and more operations into those regions. So it's all coincidental. And he's bringing this up at the Atlantic Council. How much awareness in the US is there, do you think, that the European Union is so interested in this particular area and that they're using that as an excuse to develop their military capabilities?
Probably not a great deal. A lot of people that attend these meetings are, local government workers, not always the brightest bulbs in the lamp shop. There's a few wonks from other think tanks that come over, the occasional congressman and senator. Ben Wallace spoke a lot about conflict as if conflict was this disembodied spirit that just invades countries, and it's up to the West, the UK and the US to either mitigate or stamp out this conflict because this radicalism will just spring out of nowhere. And so we have to be ready at a moment's notice to quell terrorism, to quell the rise of right-wing extremism, to quell the rise of Islamic extremism, wherever this conflict or dissidence might come about. And so Mr. Wallace put everything in those terms, like, we have to be vigilant for the slightest hint of radicalism or extremism coming out of whatever part of the world, and the U.S. and Britain and NATO stand ready. But again, he steadfastly avoided talking about the European Defense Union, and everybody's very, very tight-lipped about it. I talked to a journalist, Ali Rogan, who was a moderator with Mr. Wallace toward the end of the program yesterday at the Atlantic Council, and even she acted like she had barely heard of the Defense Union. So it's just really strange how much either ignorance or denial there is about that event, or about that union, excuse me. I'll just note that Mr. Wallace noted that he talked about the Western values of justice, tolerance, and liberty need to be free to flourish, hence the need to stamp out all this extremism. And he said, that's why our contribution to security, whether on the European continent or further afield, remains iron cast. The security of Europe is vital to the UK's security. That will not change just because we have left the political union of the EU. And of course, NATO remains the cornerstone of that security. So he was sort of hinting at that defense union there in very subtle terms. And he went on to say that, Britain should be credited with helping tackle Ebola in Sierra Leone, their vital humanitarian aid in Kosovo. Britain led the NATO efforts to help stop genocide in the parts of former Yugoslavia. And all this has played a huge role in enhancing the UK's reputation around the globe. This sort of rounds out his main comments.
Yes.
Yeah. And we just remind viewers and listeners, of course, that Mr. Ben Wallace is spouting all of this. He's talking about all of this to a think tank in America. None of this has been discussed from the floor of the House. None of this has been debated in front of the British public or put out by the BBC. So the meeting itself is, we could say, devious, because who are these people that Ben Wallace is having to give his play to?
Yes.
Let's ask you that question, Mark. Who are the people that are forming this organisation and can summon Mr. Ben Wallace as a leader to come and talk to them?
Well, the Atlantic Council, of course, is basically an affiliate of NATO, and their international advisors include Brent Scowcroft, Henry Kissinger, David Petraeus, and others that come right out of the Bilderberg playbook. When I was at two programs of the Atlantic Council this week. The Estonian president was also there the day before.
We're just going to come on to that one. We're going to come on to that one in a second.
And I met Zbigniew Brzezinski's son, Ian, so he's there too, the Brzezinski family. So it's deep state. The Atlantic Council is deep state. It's part of the private government structure of the U.S. and the West that, basically developed the policy framework and the policy and technology infrastructure that they basically use in conjunction with key elements of the government to inaugurate lots of changes behind the scenes. By the time you hear about it in Parliament or Congress, it's a done deal.
Yeah,
that's the way it works.
Okay, now if you like what the UK Column does and you would like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community. where there are options to support us there. And that would be much needed and much appreciated. Now, as Mark has just mentioned, he attended another Atlantic Council meeting, which was all about completing Europe. So this was the President of the Republic of Estonia. It was described as a town hall discussion on completing Europe, Central Europe, the Three Seas Initiative, and the future of the transatlantic relationship. And they say that she was addressing the future of Central and Eastern Europe's role in the transatlantic relationship, the growing economic opportunities present in the region, the important role it plays in the West's efforts to grapple with the challenges of great power competition, and the steps that need to be taken to complete the vision of Europe that is undivided, free, and secure. I'm not sure that's quite the vision of Europe that many people in Europe have at the moment. Mark, once again, we've got this notion of great power competition, and we've seen this being expressed increasingly. And for example, it was expressed not too many months ago by Guy Verhofstadt at the Liberal Democrat conference. I think what was that, October or something last year, expressed very, very clearly. So this is something which seems to be at the forefront of the Western mindset at the moment, if we want to put it that way, the idea of great power competition.
Yeah, those three words, great power competition, was used at Brookings on Monday and at the Atlantic Council on Wednesday and Thursday, those exact words. So the globalese, the way they talk, the way they couch their phrases and their language is all coordinated, and it's quite clear what they mean. The main rival is Russia. But it's interesting, it's a curious title, right? Completing Europe. Well, now that the UK has ostensibly left the European Union, I guess they feel like there's something missing, perhaps, and so they need to complete Europe. So this program, as noted by Jim Jones and the Estonian leader, Kersti Kaljulaid, and Jim Jones is a former U.S. military officer and chairman emeritus of the Atlantic Council, The main thing here is they're going to integrate Central and Eastern Europe into the economic and geopolitical framework of a wider Europe and the transatlantic community. And the key element of this is this Three Seas initiative, which, as they noted, is not a household thing, not a household name. And the Three Seas initiative, seas as in oceans, is the cross-border security, transportation, and digital infrastructure. I'll repeat, cross-border security, transportation, and digital infrastructure. Of course, digital infrastructure is going to be the Internet of Things. It's going to be global cities. When I asked whether that includes global cities, they kind of denied that, but I don't think they were being honest with me. The Internet of Things and the global cities movement will fit right into this. And the basic region is between the Baltic, Black, and Adriatic Seas for this Three Seas initiative. Again, cross-border security, transportation, digital infrastructure. And they're calling it a tremendous undertaking, a huge undertaking of tremendous importance, that is. Economic growth is supposed to be sustained and enhanced, and Europe's economic resilience, including its energy sector, are supposed to be expanded. And that includes, and this was a major point, to finally wean Europe off of Russian energy sources and the dependency on Russia, and make Europe, all of Europe, Central, Eastern, and all of Europe, make it totally independent of Russian energy sources, so they're no longer dependent on Russia, and therefore they can throw their geopolitical weight around much more. Of course, they've been talking about that, as you guys know, for a long time, but they seem to be solidifying it now. And they noted that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo of the U.S. just laid down $1 billion, billion with a B, to get the Three Seas foundational funds going for the Three Seas initiative. So that's the biggest thing right now, is that money.
So they're talking about the Three Seas Initiative Investment Fund being established, which they say is going to attract international private capital into the region.
Right.
And this Three Seas, it seems like a regional subset of the European Union. It's all EU member states, but they're coalescing in a regional body. This is something which is very European in structure, because of course the Europeans only think in terms of regions and within the European Union.
Mike, we should probably bring in that somebody said that this is a Three Seas initiative going back to a French-Polish pre-World War II plan called Intermarium to destroy Russia. So somebody's come up with a little bit of historic knowledge there that actually this is a rerun of something that's been done or tried earlier.
Yeah, so getting back to the 3Cs Initiative Investment Fund, Mark, do we know what kind of private, international private capital they're looking for?
No, they simply said that there's going to be private capital, that it's going to happen. They didn't get into the specifics, excuse me. Kirsty Calloway has a rather difficult accent. I didn't always follow her real closely on exactly what she said. That being said, private investment is being encouraged, and they anticipate it, but they did not get into a lot of specifics. I'm going to be writing an article, and I'll share it with you guys for your website if you'd like. It'll be on my blog too, probably, that'll get into more specifics. I'll give them a phone call and see if I can find that out. But they're definitely anticipating a lot of that. And there's going to be in Estonia a summit about this June.
Okay. Well, let's move on then to coronavirus, and of course we're all going to die from that. But in the meantime, Mark, the New York Post highlighting the fact that actually most of us are going to live.
Yes, me and a longtime partner with American Free Press that I've written for, Pete Papaheracles. I'm here at his place here today. We discussed this because we did a lot of research together in past years, and we were talking about how the big line media, the mass media cartel, as I call it, up until just a day or two ago, was not talking at all about the tens of thousands of recoveries. In China, there's been something like 100,000 people diagnosed, but about half or better have reportedly recovered. And the New York Post began to report this. USA Today finally brought it out. I asked around on Capitol Hill covering the Senate and House this week. There was no talk on the Senate floor or on the House floor about recoveries. They were talking about the danger of the coronavirus. The Senate yesterday on March 5th approved a big funding package for the coronavirus to fight this so-called pandemic, but no mention in Congress of the tens of thousands of recoveries. A little bit less recoveries in the US and the UK, but they're still there. Recoveries in Australia, several recoveries, pretty significant in Italy. As I said, tens of thousands of recoveries in China. And this is the thing, we're not saying it's not serious, but Chinese herbal medicine, nutrition, people exercising common sense. President Trump did a town hall meeting last night where he talked about precaution over panic. Don't poo-poo it, don't write it off, but exercise precaution and common sense. Don't panic. There are recoveries. He hinted. He didn't quite say the word recoveries, but he hinted at it at the town hall meeting, which was nationally televised. But this is the thing. We need cooler heads to prevail, and we need to bring this out that there are recoveries, that all is not lost.
So, Mark, in the UK, this has been, and Brian's going to come on to this in a second, but this has been very much hyped up in the sense of deliberate attempts by the media to instill fear in people, in my opinion.
Right.
Aside from these couple of more recent articles from the New York Post and so on, just briefly, has the general media coverage in the States been also of fear, merchant and hype?
Yes, the New York Times, total fear. Washington Post, total fear. Most of your internet sites like Yahoo News, MSN News, and the various postings they put up, stressing only that people are infected or dead. And the other thing they don't talk about is that there is not a completely trustworthy testing regimen. You're going to get false positives. You're going to get people that have some other ailment or malady and are falsely accused or falsely diagnosed of having the coronavirus of this particular kind. And remember, the common cold is caused by a variant of the coronavirus. Many illnesses that have been with mankind forever are caused by what are generally known as coronaviruses. So you have false positives, and you have what I just said about the common cold. And then, of course, there's the other theories that this was a deliberately created pathogen in a warfare-like plan, a warfare-like scheme, a very difficult thing to prove. And others are even saying that it's a chemical thing, and the effects of 5G are being covered up. Again, very speculative, but these are the things that are coming across cyberspace. But yeah, mostly fear-mongering here. the New York Post and USA Today being welcome exceptions, and Congress is still caught up, as I said, largely in fear-mongering and passing those funds that I mentioned yesterday.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, that's extremely interesting. Certainly fear-mongering here. We've put together a little sort of package on coronavirus. I'll go through it as quickly as I can, and that'll stimulate, I'm sure, some discussion. And then on Tuesday night locally, there was a really excellent talk that was about vaccines, which seems to link into this. But let's have a look. I chose the Daily Mail for this first headline here. The journalist, Henry Deeds, is not a, let's just pop that up on screen, is not a bad man. But I get the impression that even he was having trouble with a briefing by by Chris Whitty, who's our Chief Medical Officer, English for England, Chief Medical Officer for England. He was having some problems with him, and he quite a lot of the article, which is on supposedly an immensely serious topic where you have these really graphic embedded statistics here, cases 97,873 deaths, 3,348. He's commenting on the look of the professor himself and saying that he's sort of got poached egg eyes and he's unbelievably cool and he didn't even drink water while he was talking. So it was almost as though his mind was drifting off while this briefing on the deadly coronavirus was being given. But this was some of the stuff that's printed in the article that Professor Chris Whitty had been saying that he's expecting the number to only go up. Some 600,000 people in the UK could perish from the virus. Community transmission is already happening. So the message that's coming across, I'm going to say, in the Daily Mail article is absolute fear. Huge numbers of people could perish. This is all really terrible. But the professor who's giving this information is rather an odd chap with poached egg eyes, and he's a bit of a cool dude. And well, he didn't really take any advice. He just sat there and delivered his talk. So this is part of what was put across on the 600,000 deaths. I had to go looking for where that figure came from, and the advice was released in the Coronavirus Action Plan on Tuesday, as the number of cases in the UK rose from a whopping 39 to a whopping 51. Now, I'm not making light of the fact that we have had a death in UK.
Well, yes, but that death in the UK was somebody who was tested positive for the coronavirus, but nobody has said whether they actually died of, because this was somebody that was already ill.
Yes, did they die of the virus, or was the
something else?
Virus contributing effect? Well, this is the fear-mongering of grand scale, Mark. We've got the fact that there could be 600,000 deaths in the UK. And the professor said that even amongst the highest risk groups, the vast majority of people would survive. The mortality rate could also be lower than that because there was no way to tell how many people had the illness but no symptoms. And that's agreeing with what you're saying, that it's very difficult for them to test to even tell whether somebody has actually got the virus itself.
Just before you move on, just that a 1% rate could result in 600,000 deaths. So what he's saying there is that every single person in the country is going to get this illness.
Mike, this is one of the really bad things when you look at what the press is reporting. There are facts and figures, statistics and data that's floating around in a mush, and you're seeing statistics being used incorrectly. They apply to one particular area, but in fact those statistics are then brought across to another area, and they give a totally different meaning. So this is what he said. The mortality rate for the illness was 1% based on information from China. Well, of course, that's from the number of people who were actually diagnosed with coronavirus. However, it's higher in older people, particularly those aged over 80 and with pre-existing health conditions. So all of that we'll say factually correct. But here's another report by, this is ITV. I think it's more likely than not, and I would go much further and say it's much more likely than not that we're going to deal with a significant epidemic. How big it is still pretty uncertain. but that there will now be an epidemic is now highly likely.
Okay, so we just bandies these 600,000 figures around.
And that's a mush of words saying we're not really sure what's going on.
Yeah.
But let's look at the advice. Everything's pretty vague and uncertain, except a lot of people may or may not going to die. But you're going to wash your hands. This is the advice. You must wash your hands, although they're all saying that this is an airborne spread disease. Sorry, airborne should be spread disease there. And this one I really liked. He said that coronavirus is here. It lives amongst us. And I thought, my goodness, he's been watching a few too many horror films. The government hopes of containment are over. We've entered the phase of delaying its spread as long as we can until a vaccine is found, which is likely to be more than a year away. So not too sure what's going on, but we're going to try and delay it. I don't know how we're going to delay it, by washing our hands, possibly. And there we are. The top advice, as reported in the Daily Mail by the journalist, was wash your hands with soap and water. And for the pet owners out there, I can tell you that that advice is also now being applied if you have a pet. If you touch your dog or your pussycat, you must wash your hands. Although they say there is no evidence whatsoever linking pets to coronavirus.
So can I just understand this, Brian? The coronavirus is therefore much more serious than Novichok, because we have to wash our hands with soap and water for coronavirus, but for Novichok we only needed wet wipes.
Well, we're laughing now and chuckling, but of course this is it. What is going on here? I think we have a huge scaremongering propaganda play being played out in UK and further afield. But let's take it over to the World Health Organization. This is some of the things that they had been saying, which have been picked up, of course, by Health England here in UK. It says, first of all, COVID-19 does not transmit as efficiently as influenza from the data we have so far. With influenza, people who are infected but not yet sick are major drivers of transmission, which does not appear to be the case for COVID-19. And they go on, while many people globally have built up immunity to seasonal flu strains, COVID-19 is a new virus to which no one has immunity. This means people are more susceptible to infection and some will suffer severe cases. So this is a bit more detail about what's really going on, but a big mush as it comes into the UK media.
But there we have discrepancy between the World Health Organization statistics and the Public Health England statistics, because they're saying 3.4% of reported COVID-19 cases have died. In the UK, Professor Whitty is saying 1%, so which is it?
Yep.
By comparison, seasonal flu generally kills far fewer than 1% of those infected. That's true. But at this point, we are talking about 3,000 deaths in total. In this flu season, or in the World Health Organization statistics, since 2017, estimate around 500,000 to 600,000 people die globally from influenza every year. But we're not stopping sporting events. We're not stopping any kind of public meetings. We're not stopping flights for influenza. We're not stopping anything. We're not stopping anybody going to India because India happens to be one of the central sources for TB, which kills more people than COVID-19 has. So we're not stopping anybody doing these things. We're quite happy for airlines to go out of business as a result of COVID-19. Other businesses are going to be suffering severely because of COVID-19, because of this overreaction, in my opinion. It's not being put in the context of the other illnesses which we face every single year.
That's absolutely correct. So what we've got is mush and hype. And to support Mark in his comment about what are we actually dealing with, it's very clear that the mainstream media in UK does not want to talk about this story about where the virus came from and the laboratory in Wuhan. I just picked up on this article from The Scientist, which is talking about it, although it's ending up by trying to sort of poo-poo the idea that you had a laboratory. This is fact. China's National Biosafety Laboratory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology Now, they were apparently just by coincidence studying bat coronaviruses, and originally we were told that it was possibly bats that had spread the virus back to humans. Now, one of the gentlemen who's printed, I think it was in the Washington Post, but I may be wrong on this, but Stephen Mosher from the Population Research Institute, he said in the States that he's not saying this has been genetically engineered to be a bioweapon that's escaped from the lab. I'm just saying that China is collecting dangerous pathogens and they have a history of letting them escape from the lab. So, Mark, I'll just pass you back. Go back to you briefly to comment on that. We've been getting some very interesting information saying there are characteristics of coronavirus which do suggest it's a man-made virus. The article I've just given you says, well, we think it's very unlikely a virus would escape, but it is a remarkable coincidence that we have a lab in the middle of the very city that's got this epidemic.
Yeah, one is reminded of these coincidences when there's military and police drills going on right where there suddenly is a terrorist attack. The police were conducting drills during the Boston Marathon bombing, and all of a sudden there was a apparent bombing. Same thing on 9/11, there were drills, So then you see these experiments going on, and lo and behold, there's an outbreak. And these things, of course, feed lots of theories and insights as to what is the ultimate nature of these things. So yeah, it's entirely plausible, not proven, but plausible that this was something being worked on that got out of hand. And of course, they can't really admit that, so they have to use the fear and the panic to override our rational faculties so we don't look deeper at what the origins of these things are. And that's one of the purposes of the fear propaganda, to suspend logical and rational thought, lest we, come to our senses and solve this thing. But we can take heart in the fact that there are a lot of recoveries, that the sanitation standards in most Western countries are sufficient to ward most of this off. Most of those that have died have been the elderly and those that were sick or vulnerable already. Very few young people have passed away. And as Mike pointed out, there's hundreds of thousands of deaths from the conventional flu and other causes every year. About 40,000 of those are in America, about 40,000 regular flu deaths per year. That was brought out by Senator Roy Blunt on the Senate floor from Missouri. He only mentioned that. And then Senator John Barroso of Wyoming on the Senate floor when I was there talked about, we got to develop a vaccine, and there's a huge amount of profits there.
Right, Mark, Mark, I'll just come back in there. Brilliant cue you've just given me. We've got a little more material we want to get through today. I've got
go ahead.
an eye on the clock, but you mentioned vaccines. Before we go there, just let's have a look at how the BBC's been reacting. This was a shot of their webpage this morning. It is coronavirus. I'm going to call it a coronavirus fest. There's no other news. There's nothing on the EU Brexit without the exit with those negotiations. It's all coronavirus. But did you spot it? I nearly missed it this morning. So let's come back to their webpage. And this is the bit that I saw, which is man jailed for licking ice cream in Texas shop. Now, this has been put next to all the coronavirus headlines. And of course, what your brain immediately does is say, oh my goodness, somebody with coronavirus has been licking ice creams and putting them back in the fridge. But when we go to the article, when did this incident take place? It was in America, so I'm going to have to blame you partly for this, Mark. This was in August 2019. But the BBC puts it on the front page next to the coronavirus because it knew that that would put fear in people's minds that this was going on, an utter disgrace. And I'm just going to end by saying that there was a really excellent talk in Totnes, Devon on Tuesday night where a gentleman, Rob Ryder, was talking about the hidden histories of vaccinations. Are they safe and effective? He's not a vax denier. He's a man asking questions. This is what he says about himself. I'm just an ordinary man with some questions about vaccines. I'm not an expert, nor am I trained in medicine. So I decided to look at the government's own data. I found that data to be vague, contradictory, and biased in favour of vaccines when the evidence as their efficacy was sparse. and data on risks was sidelined or ignored. And in his presentation, which is all based on the government's own statistics, he put up some really amazing stuff. Here's a graph of deaths by diphtheria, which you see is falling. And if you do the analysis on it, the fall in the graph was happening from the late 1800s, early 1900s. So why was there that steep fall at that particular time, which you can see the left arrow? And then all doctors are told is, well, we only really got rid of diphtheria once the vaccines came in. So there is a fall after vaccines, but there was already a fall in the deaths. And what Rob Ryder says is, why will the government not explain what factors were happening to reduce those deaths? Here's another of the graphs here talking about respiratory tuberculosis. And again, we've got the same thing, that the death rates were falling anyway, well before vaccinations came in. Government is not giving doctors this evidence. It's not in their green book, and the public is not being told that this was the case when considering whether or not to have vaccines. So a really excellent talk, and I'll just bring this one in to end. Mr. Ryder pointed out that if vaccines are so safe, why does the World Health Organization need a vaccine safety summit? But of course, again, the British government, Public Health England, not telling the British public about the true dangers and of vaccines and their failure to do what they claim in some instances. Mark, we're at the end.
Well, just before you bring Mark back in, I'll just say if anybody hasn't seen the video that was shot at the World Health Organization Vaccine Safety Summit, do watch it. It's very clear that that the World Health Organization vaccine experts also have a lot of questions in their own minds about vaccine safety. They're not 100% certain of how safe vaccination programs are, and you know, it seems to me, Brian, that we are on the receiving end of a massive dose of the precautionary principle with respect to COVID-19, but the precautionary principle is thrown out with vaccinations, and
Indeed,
there
yeah.
seem to be double standards here.
Yeah, and I'll just emphasise again, what was so powerful about the talk on Tuesday was that it was based on the government's own data. It wasn't based on data from other sources. There will be a video available on that talk very shortly. Mark, 30 seconds to end.
Well, it's unfortunate that in the Senate and House, they're talking only about the accomplishment of developing a vaccine as fast as they can, while admitting that it's going to take a year or a year and a half to get something even remotely safe or worthwhile to use in that regard. And nothing is mentioned about the role of nutrition, you know, just eating less sugar, just eating more vitamin C, just garlic, olive leaf extract, lots of common supplements, and strengthening the general immune system, getting homeopathic and naturopathic medicine more front and center, not the allopathic only treat the symptoms regimen and modality that we have now that's the dominant modality. These are the things that need to happen. Other modalities of medicine, nutrition, common sense, and precaution over fear, and we'll be fine.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I can reinforce that statement by saying in the talk, it was shown that actually in some instances, the government advice with vaccination was for an increase in vitamin intake as well. So lots to talk about there. Mark, thanks very much for joining us. That's it for today. Thank you for watching, viewers for watching, and listeners for listening into UK Column. We will be back at the same time on Monday. I had to think then.
Yeah.
Mark, thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.